Clark was starting another day like any other. His job as a garbage man was simple yet exhausting, but he found a strange peace in that routine. While the city still slept, he began his journey through the empty streets. The constant sound of the garbage truck and the strong smell that many avoided were part of his reality. But for Clark, the job represented something bigger: order amidst chaos. No matter what people threw away, he knew it was his responsibility to clean it up, to put everything in its rightful place. It was a thankless job in the eyes of many, but Clark always approached it with dignity. That morning, the sun had not yet risen. The sky was a deep blue that was slowly starting to brighten. He had already covered most of his route when he stopped in front of a well-known restaurant, always busy at night but empty at that hour. The scene was familiar: piles of trash bags on the sidewalk, leftover food, luxurious packaging, and broken bottles. He was about to grab the first bag when something made him stop. A subtle movement in the middle of the trash. Clark frowned and, for a moment, thought his eyes were deceiving him. But as he got closer, his heart raced. Among the garbage bags, there was a human figure. His first thought was that it was a homeless person, probably passed out after a rough night. But as he approached, the truth began to take on a more disturbing shape. It was a young woman, lying on her side, almost covered by the trash bags around her. Her body looked fragile, her thin, pale arms exposed to the cold of the early morning. She was barefoot, her dress dirty and torn. Her face was partially covered by her hair, but he could see her lips were dry and cracked, her skin far too pale to be normal. Clark swallowed hard. She wasn't moving, and her body was so still that he feared the worst. Kneeling beside her, he desperately tried to figure out what to do. The city was deserted at that hour, and there was no one around. He cautiously reached out, gently touching her shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" His voice was calm, but inside he was filled with anxiety. She didn't respond. He shook her lightly, hoping for some sign of life, but she remained motionless. The first thing that came to mind was to call an ambulance. But as he grabbed his phone, Clark paused. The nearest hospital was a few blocks away, and he knew that at this hour, an ambulance might take too long. With every second, the young woman's life could be slipping away, and he didn't have time to waste. Looking around and realizing he was alone, Clark made an impulsive decision, but it seemed like the only choice at that moment. He lifted her into his arms. Her weight was surprisingly light, as if her physical fragility reflected her mental state or whatever had happened to her. He felt the woman's cold body against his, her breathing so faint that he could barely notice it, and that terrified him even more. Running through the empty streets, he barely felt the pain in his arms as he held her. Sweat started to trickle down his forehead, even with the biting cold of the early morning. Every step he took felt heavier, but Clark didn't stop. He could only think about saving her, about reaching the hospital in time. The world around him seemed to shrink, and all that existed in that moment was the unconscious woman in his arms and the urgency to reach their destination. As he approached the automatic doors of the hospital, Clark shouted for help. Two nurses and a doctor came rushing with a stretcher, taking the young woman from Clark's hands. He stood there, frozen, not exactly sure what to do next. His chest was heaving, both from the physical effort and the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He watched as the doctors and nurses worked quickly, taking the woman into the emergency room. In a matter of seconds, she disappeared behind the double doors, and Clark was left alone in the lobby. For a moment, he simply stood there, catching his breath and trying to process what had just happened. Who was this young woman? How had she ended up in such a terrible state, discarded among the trash as if her life had no value? Clark felt a wave of anger mixed with sadness. No one deserved to be treated like that. He sat down in one of the uncomfortable chairs in the waiting area, the silence around him interrupted only by the distant sounds of nurses and patients. The clock on the wall seemed to move slower, and each minute felt like an eternity. As he waited, his mind was flooded with questions. Was she alone? Did she have family? Friends? And why had no one noticed her disappearance? Clark, a man of few words and direct actions, now found himself immersed in a mystery he couldn't explain. Something about the situation deeply unsettled him, something that went beyond simply finding someone in danger. He felt an inexplicable connection to this young woman, as if fate had placed him there, at that exact moment, to be the one to find her. Minutes turned into hours and still, there was no news. Clark continued to wait, not even sure why he felt the need to stay. He could have left after all. He had done his part. But something kept him there. Something told him that this story was far from over, and that, somehow, he still had an important role to play in its resolution. As he stared at the emergency room doors, unsure of what to expect, Clark had no idea that this unexpected encounter was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Clark remained seated in the waiting room, unable to leave. Even after hours without any news of the young woman he had rescued, an uneasiness gnawed at him. The hospital was cold and impersonal, filled with the typical smell of antiseptic, and the quiet only heightened the tension he felt. The clock on the wall seemed to tick slower, each minute dragging on, turning the wait into a mental torture. His body was still sore from the effort of carrying the young woman to the hospital, but it wasn't just the fatigue that bothered him. The image of her, pale and fragile, lying among the trash bags as if she were disposable, wouldn't leave his mind. Who was she? How did someone end up like that, abandoned as if her life had no meaning? These questions kept repeating in his head, tying his thoughts into knots of growing concern. Suddenly, the sound of the automatic doors opening quickly broke the silence. Clark looked up, distracted by a figure entering the hospital in a hurry. It was a tall man, well-dressed, wearing an immaculate suit, a stark contrast to the environment around him. The clicking of his expensive shoes on the floor echoed through the halls, each step radiating urgency. The man seemed on edge, his eyes wide, breathing heavily as if he had just run a long distance. He walked straight to the reception desk and, without hesitation, began questioning the nurse. "I need to know. Is she here? Where is she?" he demanded, his voice firm but trembling with anxiety. From a distance, Clark leaned forward slightly, curious. He wasn't sure who the man was referring to, but as he saw the desperation in his expression, something inside Clark began to stir. The nurse, accustomed to stressful situations, remained calm but gave the man a suspicious look. "Can you give me the name of the patient, sir?" she asked, flipping through some papers on the clipboard in front of her. "Isabella. Isabella Arantes." The man practically shouted the name, his hands shaking as he gripped the counter tightly. Clark felt a chill hearing the name. Finally, a name for the woman he had found. Isabella. The nurse checked her records and nodded. "She was admitted earlier. She's receiving treatment. Were you the one who brought her in?" The man hesitated for a brief moment before responding in a more controlled voice. "No. I'm her husband. I came as soon as I heard." Clark felt a jolt of surprise and doubt. Husband? He hadn't known what to expect, but the word caught him off guard. The man in front of him certainly looked like he had money and power, with his expensive suit and authoritative posture, but something about his tone didn't sit right. It was the behavior of someone too anxious, almost desperate, but not necessarily someone concerned solely with his wife's well-being. Without knowing why, Clark couldn't help but continue watching the man. His instincts, honed by years of working the streets and encountering unexpected situations in his job, were alerting him to something. Something wasn't right. The man was in a hurry, but there was no relief in his expression upon learning that Isabella was alive and receiving treatment. There was something else, something darker lurking behind his appearance of concern. "Is she going to be all right? I need to see her immediately," the man insisted, his voice rising in tone, now impatient. The nurse, trying to remain calm, directed him toward the hallway leading to the rooms, but he seemed agitated, almost frantic. Clark discreetly rose from his seat, his body tense with the same unease that had kept him there for so long. Something about this man's behavior disturbed him deeply, like there was a second layer of intentions, something that wasn't being said. He followed at a safe distance, just to observe, trying to understand what was going on. The man entered the room where Isabella was being treated, but he left the door slightly ajar, allowing Clark to discreetly peek inside. He positioned himself in a shadowed corner of the hallway, out of view of the nurses and the man. What he saw and heard made his heart race. The man approached Isabella's bed with a tense expression, but his words were quiet and urgent. From where he stood, Clark couldn't hear clearly, but he noticed that the man wasn't speaking with tenderness or concern. It was more like he was trying to control something or someone. The man's posture, rigid and anxious, didn't match that of a husband genuinely worried about his wife's well-being, but rather that of someone trying to hide a secret. The man gestured with his hands, moving them nervously. At one point, he grabbed Isabella's arm, still unconscious, as if trying to shake her awake. At that moment, Clark's discomfort turned into an undeniable certainty. Something was very wrong. The man quickly walked past Clark, leaving through the same door he had entered, and the quiet returned to the hallway. Clark, however, could no longer calm himself. Something in that interaction, in that controlled desperation and erratic behavior, left him on high alert. He knew at that moment that Isabella's story was much more complicated and dangerous than he had initially thought. And somehow, he was now deeply involved in it. Clark couldn't shake the image of the mysterious man from his mind. There was something sinister about his presence, something that didn't fit the image of a desperate husband searching for news of his wife. The agitated behavior, the whispered words, and the way he grabbed Isabella's arm. Everything felt wrong. Clark was still standing in the hallway, lost in thought, when the nurse who had entered Isabella's room reappeared. She gave him a brief nod, reminding him that he had been waiting there for far too long. He tried to rationalize what he was feeling, telling himself that his role in this situation was over. He had found the girl, brought her to the hospital. She was being treated. Her husband was there, and things seemed to be under control. But no matter how hard he tried, Clark couldn't convince himself to leave. A gnawing sense of unease kept him rooted to the hospital, as if something more was about to happen. Minutes passed, and the flow of patients and nurses through the hallway began to slow. The fluorescent lights of the hospital flickered occasionally, casting a surreal atmosphere. That's when Clark heard the sound of movement inside Isabella's room. He paused, straining to listen, and realized it wasn't the typical sounds of nurses coming and going. It was something softer, almost like a groan. Curious and concerned, he moved closer to the slightly open door. Peeking inside, his heart skipped a beat. Isabella was awake. The woman he had rescued, who hours earlier had been on the verge of death, was now stirring in her bed, though still visibly weak. Her eyes were open, but she seemed disoriented, as if struggling to understand where she was. Clark hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should approach. He was a stranger after all, but something inside him urged him to act. He knocked gently on the door and entered quietly. "Are you all right?" His voice came out almost in a whisper, as if he didn't want to startle her. Isabella's eyes immediately locked onto him, wide with surprise. For a second, Clark thought she might not recognize him, that she was too confused to remember anything. But to his surprise, her eyes filled with something he didn't expect: panic. And then, without warning, she reached out, grabbing his arm with a strength that seemed impossible for someone in her condition. "Please, don't leave me here," she begged, her voice weak but filled with desperation. Her fingers dug into Clark's arm as if her life depended. "He said he was your husband," Clark commented, still trying to make sense of the situation. "But you seem afraid of him." "Husband?" Isabella repeated with a bitter laugh. "He's not my husband. He just says that to keep control. We don't have anything. Never did. He's dangerous. And he's coming back. I know he is." Clark looked around, feeling the weight of the situation intensify. They were in a hospital, a place that should have been safe. But for Isabella, there was no safety. She was being hunted by a man who terrified her. The dilemma formed quickly in his mind. He could simply call the police, report what was happening, and step away. That would be the rational choice, the way to delegate responsibility to people who, in theory, knew how to handle it. But as he looked at Isabella, desperate and vulnerable, something inside Clark prevented him from making that decision. He had found her, brought her to the hospital, and now she was asking for his help, trusting him in a way few people would. He felt that somehow fate had placed him there for more than just rescuing her in that initial moment. She needed him now, more than ever. "I'm not leaving you," he said finally, his voice steady and firm. "But we need to get out of here. If he's really coming after you, it's not safe to stay. We'll figure out a way to get you out of here, okay?" Isabella looked at him with a mixture of relief and fear. She let out a shaky breath, as if she had been holding it for too long, and her fingers loosened their grip on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but full of emotion. Clark nodded. He knew there was no turning back now. He was committed to this mission. Now he just needed to figure out how to get Isabella out of that hospital before the mysterious man returned. Clark felt the weight of the decision he had just made. He wasn't a hero, nor was he someone used to getting involved in situations like this. His job was to clean the streets, do what needed to be done, and live the simple life he had built for himself. But at that moment, looking at Isabella, her eyes full of fear and the invisible scars of a painful past, he knew he couldn't simply ignore her plea for help. There was something much bigger happening, and now he was involved up to his neck. "We need to get out of here," Clark repeated, glancing down the hallway. He didn't know exactly how they would do it, but the urgency was clear. The man who claimed to be her husband was somewhere outside, and he could return at any moment. The hospital, a place that should have provided safety and protection, now felt like a trap. Clark helped Isabella stand up. She was weak, her legs unsteady, barely able to hold her own weight. He supported her carefully, feeling how fragile she was. Every movement was slow and painful, as if just standing was a monumental effort for Isabella. She let out a soft moan, and Clark looked at her with concern. "Can you walk?" he asked, his tone gentle but worried. Isabella nodded, even though her eyes told a different story. I can manage. Just help me." Clark supported her by the waist, guiding her as they slowly made their way toward the door of the room. Each step seemed to drain her remaining energy. They moved cautiously, careful not to draw attention. The hallway was surprisingly empty, an unexpected stroke of luck that made their escape easier. As they walked, Clark noticed his heart beating faster, not from physical exertion, but from the tension mounting with every second. At any moment, the man in the suit could return, and they needed to be far away when that happened. As they approached the door leading to the parking lot, Clark turned to Isabella and whispered, "Is there anyone waiting for you? Somewhere we can go?" She paused, her gaze distant, almost as if trying to remember something she had blocked out. I was just trying to run. I didn't have a clear plan. I just wanted to disappear. I kept moving from city to city. I thought he wouldn't find me, but he always does." Clark felt a tightness in his chest. The desperation in Isabella's voice was real. She had no one. She was alone, running from a dangerous man, living in the shadows, unable to trust anyone. He knew what that meant. She had nowhere to go. "Then you're coming with me," he said without hesitation. Clark hadn't planned this, but the words came naturally. The idea of leaving her alone was impossible to consider. He didn't know exactly how, but he knew he was going to protect her, no matter what. They passed through the automatic doors and reached the parking lot. The cold morning air hit their faces, bringing a brief moment of relief. Clark scanned the area, his eyes quickly searching for any sign of the man who was hunting them. The parking lot was empty. He let out a breath, relieved, but he knew that wouldn't last. They needed to leave as soon as possible. "My truck is on the other side," Clark said, pointing toward the large vehicle parked further down. He helped Isabella walk toward the garbage truck he used for work. The irony of the situation struck him for a brief moment. Him, a simple garbage man, now helping a woman escape a dangerous situation. There was no time to dwell on that. He just acted. When they reached the truck, Clark opened the door and helped Isabella climb in with difficulty. She was breathless, exhausted from the effort, but still determined. Clark got in on the other side and started the engine quickly. The sound of the motor seemed too loud in the quiet of the early morning, and he glanced around, half expecting the man in the suit to appear out of nowhere. With the truck in motion, they pulled out of the parking lot. Clark drove through the empty streets with no clear destination in mind. He didn't know exactly where they would go, but his priority was to get as far away from the hospital and that man as possible. As the streetlights passed through the windows of the truck, Isabella began to speak. "He always knows where to find me," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Clark glanced over at her, splitting his attention between the road and her words. "No matter how much I run, he always finds a way to track me down. I tried everything. I changed cities, changed my name, but he always found me. How did he do it? Clark asked, curiosity mixed with concern. There was something deeper to this story, something he still didn't fully understand. Isabella looked out the window, as if trying to find an answer in the lights flashing by. He has connections, people who work for him. He's influential, powerful. He's always been able to manipulate everything around him. When I first tried to escape, I thought I'd succeeded, but soon they came after me. They brought me back. Clark felt a wave of indignation rise inside him. He knew there were men like this, men who used their money and influence to control others. But hearing it from someone so vulnerable as Isabella made him feel an anger he wasn't used to carrying. Did he hurt you? Clark asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. Isabella hesitated, her hand trembling slightly in her lap. Not physically, but he broke me in other ways. He isolated me from everything and everyone, made me believe there was no way out, that I'd never have my life back, made me feel worthless. Clark gripped the steering wheel tighter. Each word she said was like a knife to his heart. How could someone be so cruel? How could anyone rob someone else's freedom in such a devastating way? And the worst part was that Isabella seemed to believe the lies that man had planted in her mind. Listen, you're not worthless, Clark said, his voice coming out more firmly than he expected. You managed to escape. You resisted. That's already more than most people would have done. And now I'm here. I'm going to help you. Isabella looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. For the first time in a long time, she seemed to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. The drive to the rural area wasn't short, and as they left the city behind, the landscape began to change. The bright city lights were replaced by the darkness of empty roads and fields, stretching into the distance. Isabella began to relax a little, her once tense hands now resting in her lap. Fatigue was finally overtaking her, and her eyes grew heavy. Clark noticed this and kept quiet, allowing her to rest. As he drove, Clark thought about the place they were heading to. It was a simple house, an old property that had belonged to his grandfather, where he used to spend time as a child. The place had been empty for years, abandoned, but he knew it was still safe. There was no cell phone signal, no internet, the kind of place no one would think to look for her. After a few hours on the road, the sky began to lighten, and the first light of morning appeared on the horizon. Clark turned the truck onto a dirt road that led to the refuge. As they drove further, the landscape became more isolated, with tall, dense trees blocking any view beyond the path. We're almost there, Clark said, glancing over at Isabella, who was groggy beside him. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the soft light of the morning. Finally, they reached the house. It was an old wooden structure with large windows, but worn down by time. The vegetation around it had grown wild, covering part of the facade, but the place still had a welcoming feel. Clark turned off the truck and got out, walking over to the front door. It's not much, but it'll keep us safe for a while, he said, opening the door and helping Isabella down from the truck. She looked around, still a little disoriented, but for the first time she seemed to breathe more easily. The isolation of the place, the absolute silence, brought a sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. Clark led her inside the house, and despite the dust that had accumulated, the interior was comfortable enough. He quickly prepared a makeshift bed on the floor for her to rest. You can sleep here. I'm going to check outside, make sure everything's in order, he said, offering her a reassuring smile. Isabella nodded, too exhausted to argue. She lay down on the mattress, feeling the weight of her exhaustion finally overpowering her. Clark covered her with an old but warm blanket and stepped outside to survey the perimeter. As he walked the property, Clark reflected on everything that had happened in the past few hours. He didn't know Isabella, but somehow he felt a responsibility for her. Something deeper than just empathy connected him to her now. She trusted him, and he couldn't fail her. When he returned to the house, Clark found her sleeping soundly. She looked so fragile, so broken by fear and trauma, but there was also an underlying strength there, a determination to survive. He felt a strange connection to her, something that went beyond words. Now, as the sun slowly rose, one thing was clear to Clark. He would do whatever it took to protect her. Clark drove along the empty rural roads, the garbage truck rumbling softly in the stillness of the early morning. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, but he knew he needed to think quickly if he wanted to keep Isabella safe. The faint glow of the streetlights and the distant sound of crickets only heightened the tension in the air. Isabella was curled up in the passenger seat, breathing heavily. Her eyes, still red from crying, stared out the window as if expecting the man who had terrorized her to appear out of the darkness at any moment. Clark glanced over at her, feeling the weight of her vulnerability. The physical and emotional exhaustion was clear, and every movement she made was cautious, as if her body itself was trapped in the constant fear of being found. "He always finds me," she murmured, more to herself than to Clark. "Always." Those words echoed in Clark's mind like a bitter reminder. He was already involved, and there was no turning back. But the magnitude of the danger hit him in waves. He needed a plan, something that would not only keep Isabella safe, but also put an end to this nightmare for good. But how do you fight someone who seemed to have eyes everywhere? "I won't let that happen," Clark finally said, his voice more firm than he felt inside. "He won't find you this time." Isabella turned her head slowly to look at him. Her eyes, now clearer after the tears, were filled with doubt. To her, those were just words, empty promises that others had made before, but never kept. Clark could see it in her face. The emotional scars that man had left on Isabella were too deep, and her trust in people had been shattered. For a few minutes, silence reigned inside the truck, with only the sound of the engine and the soft creaking of the suspension breaking the quiet. Isabella leaned back in the seat, trying to calm her mind. Clark kept driving, his thoughts racing as he tried to figure out where they could go. He knew they couldn't just keep driving forever. That man, with his web of influence and power, was probably already moving pieces to find them. "Do you have any place safe? Someone you trust?" Clark asked suddenly, keeping his eyes on the road. Isabella hesitated. She had been alone for so long. No friends, no family who could protect her. The endless escape had destroyed her connections to the outside world. She shook her head slowly. "No, no one. I'm alone." Her words landed heavily on Clark. He knew the escape would be difficult, but the complete absence of any support network made her even more vulnerable. A mix of indignation and sadness rose in him as he thought about how anyone could be so cruel as to strip someone of all their ties to the world. After a few more minutes of silence, he made a decision. "I know a place far away, outside the city, where no one will look for you. It's in the countryside, isolated. You can rest there, at least until we figure out what to do next." Isabella looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Why are you doing this?" Her question came without warning, but it carried a raw vulnerability. "You found me, but you don't know me. Why are you helping me?" Clark thought for a moment. He didn't have a clear answer, something that could be summed up in a single sentence. There was something about Isabella, a fragility, a pain, that he couldn't ignore. Maybe it was a sense of justice, or maybe he was just tired of seeing the world being so cruel to people who didn't deserve it. "I know it seems strange," he began, choosing his words carefully, "but I couldn't just leave you there. I couldn't walk away knowing you were in danger. And now, well, now it feels like we're in this together." He shrugged, trying to downplay the intensity of the situation, but Isabella looked at him with a new expression. For a moment, Clark felt something inside her break, an invisible barrier she had built to protect herself. For the first time in a long time, she allowed a small spark of trust to ignite. The road to the countryside wasn't short, and as they left the city behind, the scenery began to change. The bright lights of the buildings were replaced by the darkness of the empty roads and fields, stretching far into the distance. Isabella began to relax a little, her once tense hands now resting in her lap. The physical exhaustion was finally taking over, and her eyes grew heavy. Clark noticed this and remained quiet, allowing her to rest. As they drove, Clark thought about the place they were heading to. It was a simple house, an old property that had belonged to his grandfather, where he used to spend a few seasons as a child. The place had been empty for years, abandoned, but he knew it was still safe. There was no cell phone signal, no internet. It was the kind of place no one would think to look for her. After a few hours on the road, the sky began to lighten, and the first light of morning appeared on the horizon. Clark turned the truck onto a dirt road, which led them to the refuge. As they continued driving, the landscape became more isolated, with tall, dense trees blocking any view beyond the path. "We're almost there," Clark said, glancing over at Isabella, who was groggy beside him. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the soft morning light. Finally, they arrived at the house. It was an old wooden structure with large windows that had been weathered by time. The vegetation around it had grown wild, covering part of the facade, but the place still had a welcoming feel. Clark turned off the truck and got out, walking to the front door. "It's not much, but it'll keep us safe for a while," he said, opening the door and helping Isabella out of the truck. She looked around, still a bit disoriented, but for the first time she seemed to breathe a little easier. The isolation of the place, the absolute silence, brought a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. Clark guided her inside the house, and despite the dust that had accumulated, the interior was comfortable enough. He quickly prepared a mattress on the floor for her to rest. "You can sleep here. I'll go check around outside, make sure everything's okay," he said, offering a reassuring smile. The sun was fully up by the time Clark, still sitting on the porch of the house, gazed out at the landscape around them. The isolation of the rural area was almost therapeutic. The sound of the leaves rustling in the wind and birds chirping created an atmosphere of peace. For a few hours he had managed to forget the looming danger that hung over them. Isabella was still sleeping, finally at peace after what seemed like weeks, perhaps months, of constant running and fear. Clark cherished the silence, but his mind never stopped racing. He knew that the man in the suit, Isabella's husband, would not give up easily. A man with that much power and influence wouldn't let her slip away without a fight. What concerned him the most was that he still didn't have a clear plan. Hiding out in this place was only a temporary solution. They needed to find a way to confront the situation once and for all. But how could they do that when their enemies seemed to have eyes everywhere? Inside the house, Isabella woke up slowly, feeling the warmth of the sun that streamed into the room through the windows. When she opened her eyes, it took a moment for her to remember where she was. When the memory returned, she felt strangely calm. The space around her was simple, but welcoming. For the first time in a long time, she had slept deeply, without nightmares, without the constant fear of being found. She stood up slowly, still feeling a bit weak, but her mind was clearer. She walked toward the door and saw Clark outside, looking out at the horizon. Without making a sound, she observed him for a few seconds. He was a simple man, with no grand ambitions, but there was something about him. "Thank you," Isabella said, her voice soft but full of emotion. Clark turned to her, a slight smile on his face. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what any decent person would do." She shook her head, silently disagreeing. "No, Clark. No one else did what you did. I've been alone for so long, and you were the only one who really tried to help me." Silence settled between them for a few seconds as both absorbed the intensity of the situation. Clark stood up, walking over to her. "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly, "but we need to think about the next step. We can't stay here forever. He'll find us sooner or later." Isabella sighed, running her hand through her messy hair. She knew he was right. As safe as the place seemed, it was only a matter of time before they were found. The man who hunted her had power, resources, and wouldn't rest until he brought her back under his control. The idea of returning to that nightmare terrified her. "I know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But what can we do? I've tried running so many times. He always finds me. He has people everywhere. Police, investigators. He knows where I am before I even move." Clark stayed silent for a moment, pondering her words. He knew that confronting someone with that level of power would be dangerous, but something inside him told him that simply running was no longer an option. If he always finds you, then we need to do something different. Instead of running, maybe it's time to face this guy. Isabella looked at him, surprised. Face him? But how? He controls everything. Clark looked at her with determination. No one controls everything, Isabella. Everyone has a weakness. And if he's chasing you like this, it's because you have something he wants, something that scares him. He might have money and power, but you have freedom, and that's something he can't buy. Isabella reflected on those words. Clark was right about one thing. Her freedom was the only thing she still had, and that was exactly what the man wanted to take from her. You think we can fight him? I I tried before, but no one believed me. He manipulates people, circumstances. We need evidence, Clark said, his mind already working on a plan. If we can expose who he really is, reveal what he's done to you, what he's trying to hide, then he'll lose control. No one is untouchable, Isabella. Every monster falls eventually. She felt a flicker of hope spark inside her. For so long she had felt powerless, trapped in a web of lies and manipulation. But now, for the first time, she saw a real possibility of escaping that cycle of fear. Clark believed in her, and more than that, he was willing to fight by her side. But how are we going to do that? She asked, her tone still cautious, but with a new sense of determination growing. He hides everything so well. Clark thought for a moment. We'll start by looking behind the scenes. We need to find someone who's inside his circle, someone who might be willing to talk. These guys always make mistakes, and when they fall, people around them start to turn. Someone must be dissatisfied with him. Someone knows more than they're letting on. We can go after that person. Isabella nodded, beginning to see the logic in the plan. She knew the man who hunted her wasn't invincible, and Clark was right. There was always someone willing to talk, as long as they were pressured the right way. You're willing to go that far for me? She asked, surprised by Clark's willingness to put himself in danger for someone he barely knew. Clark looked at her with a sincere smile. I'm already in this deep, and besides, you deserve to have your life back, Isabella. No one should live in fear. If there's something I can do to help, I'll do it. A wave of emotion washed over Isabella, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a real connection to another person. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, a trust that had grown out of pain and chaos. The following days were spent meticulously planning. Clark used contacts from old friends, people he had known since his youth, to try and gather information about the man who hunted Isabella. Meanwhile, they prepared for the battle ahead. Isabella slowly regained her physical and emotional strength, and with Clark's support, she began to believe that she could, in fact, reclaim her freedom. Finally, after weeks of preparation, the moment came. They tracked down a former employee who had worked for the man, someone who had been discarded after years of loyalty. He was bitter and resentful, and with a little persuasion, agreed to help. The former employee provided documents and valuable information, evidence that could incriminate the man in multiple crimes. With this evidence in hand, Clark and Isabella went to the police, this time armed with undeniable proof. Isabella's story finally gained credibility, and the authorities began to take action. Within days, the man who had been hunting her was arrested, his connections exposed, and his empire of power began to crumble. When it was all over, Isabella and Clark stood in front of the house where they had hidden. The nightmare was finally over. She looked at Clark, her eyes full of gratitude and something deeper. I couldn't have done it without you, she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Clark smiled, wrapping an arm around her. You always had the strength inside you. I was just here to remind you. They looked out at the horizon, the sun setting, marking the end of a long and painful journey, and the beginning of a new life for both of them, where freedom and hope finally replaced fear. And so we come to the end of this story. If you like this story full of twists and turns, leave a like to support the channel.